Good morning, my name's Frances Shannon. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research at the University of Canberra, standing in for Professor Stephen Parker, Vice-Chancellor, who is away. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning.
Well, this has been an interesting week in politics. Turnbull's move to ask the Governor-General to recall Parliament caught many political players off guard, and he's put a tough decision to the Senate. He needs 6 out of 8 non-Green crossbenchers to pass his legislation. How amenable do you think they will be to passing that legislation given their response in the past?
This is the government's industrial legislation to have tougher rules governing trade unions and also to restore the Australian Building and Construction Commission as a watchdog on the building industry. Now, the crossbenchers have so far, and especially this week, but not been amenable at all to a deal. They basically are very angry about the changes to Senate voting rules, which were put through last week in that marathon all-night session, and anyway, they weren't that keen on this industrial legislation. So at the moment, things are not looking as though it will get through.
So it does look like then we'll be headed to an election in July with a double dissolution, is that right?
Yes, that's right, and many people think that that is Malcolm Turnbull's preferred option anyway, that if the Senate did pass the legislation, he might not be so happy. But anyway, if he wins a double dissolution election, he gets the legislation through a joint sitting, and if the crossbenchers give in, he gets it that way too. And also, there is another consideration that while there are new voting rules that in fact go against small parties, small players being elected to the Senate, it's still a bit unpredictable how a Senate would look after a double dissolution, because of course there's a smaller quota of votes needed to be elected, so you could still get some small players back. For example, Jackie Lambie from Tasmania, the very outspoken Jackie Lambie, could well get back.
That would be interesting. What shape do you think Bill Shorten is in leading up to such an election, especially given that the industrial matters and unions would be front and centre on all of that?
I don't think Bill Shorten's very well placed when the issue is union power, union bad behaviour. I think from his point of view, it would be better if the crossbenchers did give in and this legislation was passed and there wasn't an election where these issues were front and centre. Of course, the election would be about much more than simply industrial matters, but in a double dissolution triggered by these bills, industrial issues would be to the fore more than if, for example, it was a normal election held, say, in September.
And what will be the key matters for the election that if it comes in July?
Apart from the industrial issues, I think tax will be right up there. We don't yet have the government's tax package. We now know that that package will be in the budget. There was a lot of talk earlier about whether it was going to be a separate statement before the budget. Now it's the budget. The budget, of course, is a week early, and so the whole budget, and especially the tax package, would be a central issue. Beyond that, I think it'll be leadership, who's best to manage the economy, health, education, those sorts of issues.
Now, the budget moving forward brings me to the next question, which is Treasurer Scott Morrison appeared to be saying the budget was not going to move right up until the last minute when Malcolm Turnbull said it would move. Is this any indication of serious tension between the Treasurer and the Prime Minister?
Well, there is tension between the two. Scott Morrison on various things seems to have been a bit out of kilter with the Prime Minister. For example, he went out very hard on the tax mix switch and got hoist on the GST issue. The Prime Minister cut him off at the knees eventually on that, and that wasn't a good look. On this question, it has become an embarrassment this week because Scott Morrison was so definite an hour before the Prime Minister's statement saying, no, it's May 10. In fact, I think that Scott Morrison just should have been a lot more cautious. There'd been discussions the week before of this double dissolution, put a gun at the head of the Senate option, which would mean that the budget came back. In the media, there'd been much talk of the budget coming back. The leadership group all knew that this was a probability, and so it was very foolish of Scott Morrison to get himself into that jam, and it's just exacerbated this talk of tension and has been an irritation all week.
Tony Abbott reared his head again to what would appear to be protecting his political legacy, and that forced Turnbull to outline his achievements since he became Prime Minister. Is Abbott right to say that Turnbull is seeking re-election on the Abbott record or Abbott achievements?
Both have a case here. I think that Tony Abbott is totally exaggerating his side of the case, though. Obviously, there's continuity, as Malcolm Turnbull has said, but he also has a different agenda, which he is increasingly spelling out. One interesting aspect of the continuity, though, this week, I think, was the Prime Minister's address to the Lowy Institute. And this, of course, coincidentally, was in the wake of the Belgian attacks. And there was a lot of echo of what Tony Abbott used to say about porous borders in Europe and the Islamic State taking advantage of the refugee crisis in Europe. So we saw on that issue that Malcolm Turnbull was sounding a bit more like Tony Abbott than he might have a year ago before he became leader.
Well, I guess we will wait to see how things work out for Malcolm Turnbull and whether we do have an election in July. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Francis.